There is a particular kind of humiliation reserved for experts, not the humiliation of ignorance that can be forgiven, explained away, blamed on circumstance. The humiliation of expertise defeated on its own ground. He stood at the front of rooms his whole career and told other people how money worked and how to protect it and where the dangers lived. He wrote the warnings, he gave the seminars. He was, by every professional measure, the man who was supposed to know better. And then he met a woman at a wealth management summit in BGC who understood his confidence better than he did and used it against him with a precision that still makes him go quiet when he thinks about it. This is what it costs to be certain you cannot be fooled. The brochure for the Wealth Management Summit was good. I noticed that immediately when it arrived in my email. Whoever had designed it knew what sophisticated looked like. Clean layout, no clutter, the right fonts, the right vocabulary. Guest speakers listed with credentials from institutions I recognized. A venue in BGC that I knew by reputation. Registration fee that was high enough to signal quality without being absurd. Everything about it read like the real thing, because most of it was the real thing. That was the part I understood too late. My name is Nigel. Wait, I go by Victor. Victor Holt. 61 years old, financial consultant, London-based, 28 years advising high-net-worth individuals on wealth preservation, investment strategy, and risk management. I had spoken at summits like this one in Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. I knew the circuit. I knew the format. I knew what legitimate looked like, and I knew what off looked like, and I had made a career out of telling other people the difference. I came to Manila for the summit and stayed because the city got into me in a way I hadn't expected. My marriage had ended quietly 3 years before, not dramatically, just the long, slow recognition that two people who had grown alongside each other for 22 years had eventually grown in directions that no longer overlapped. My daughter Claire lived in Edinburgh and called regularly, and was kind about the divorce in the careful way young people are kind about their parents' failures. My son Marcus lived in Vancouver and was less available but sent texts that arrived at unexpected hours and always made me smile. I was not a broken man. I want to be clear about that. I was a functional, professionally successful, financially literate man who had been quietly lonely for 3 years and had arrived in Manila with a speaking engagement, a hotel room, and more openness than I would have admitted to at the time. I met Liezl at the summit's opening reception. She was 31, slim and composed in a maroon dress that struck exactly the right note for the room. Professional, confident, present. She had a name badge, she had business cards. She had the particular quality of focused attention that makes you feel, when someone is talking to you, that you are the most interesting person they have encountered all evening. She said she was a financial analyst with a Manila-based wealth management firm. She named the firm. I recognized it, or thought I did, which I now understand is not the same thing. She spoke about the Philippine investment landscape with fluency and specificity. She asked about my London practice with questions that demonstrated she understood what I did at a level above the surface. She pushed back, gently, on one point I made about regional market correlations, and she wasn't wrong to push back, and the pushback impressed me more than agreement would have. We talked for 40 minutes at the opening reception, then longer over dinner, at a table of 8 that sorted itself naturally into 2 conversations, and ours was the better one. By the end of the evening I had her number and an invitation to coffee the following morning, and the slightly electric feeling of a professional encounter that had become something else without anyone quite declaring it. I told myself it was just professional interest. I told myself that for about 2 weeks. The coffee became a tour of BGC she offered to give me since I had 3 days after the summit before my flight home. She knew the city well, the galleries, the restaurants, the particular neighborhoods that foreigners miss because the guidebooks are always behind the actual city. She was good company in a way that went beyond charm. She was interesting. She had opinions about things that had nothing to do with finance, architecture, the food politics of Manila's street markets, a book she was reading about post-colonial economics she could discuss at a level that made me wish I'd read it. I extended my trip by a week. She asked, on the 4th day, whether I'd considered any Philippine investment positions. She said it carefully, not as a pitch, as a question. She said she'd been watching a particular infrastructure bond vehicle that she thought showed interesting characteristics for a UK investor looking at emerging market diversification. She said she only mentioned it because my background suggested I'd find the structural details interesting, not because she was soliciting anything. I found the structural details interesting. I asked her to explain them. What followed over the next 3 weeks, 2 of which I spent back in London with calls and emails flowing between us daily, was one of the most intellectually stimulating financial conversations I had engaged in for years. She knew the product, she knew the regulatory framework. She referenced reports I could and did verify. She sent me research that was real research from real institutions. She acknowledged risks I raised without deflecting them. She presented the analysis the way a serious professional presents analysis, with the weaknesses visible. That was how she did it, not by hiding the weaknesses, by showing me enough of them that I felt I was conducting due diligence, while actually being guided through a presentation designed to end in one place. I went back to Manila 6 weeks after the summit. I told myself it was partly business and partly that I wanted to see her again, and I knew which part was driving it, and I said business anyway. My colleague in London, a man named Jeffrey, who had been my professional partner for 11 years, and who has a particularly good nose for situations I am telling myself are one thing when they are another, asked me on a call in late October what I was doing. Following up on some regional market work, I said. In Manila, yes, for the third time in 2 months. The investment landscape there is genuinely interesting, Jeffrey. There was a pause of exactly the length of a man who has known you for 11 years and has decided not to say the thing he is thinking. Just be careful, he said. That's all. I told him I was always careful, which was true in every context except the one I was currently operating in. Liezl and I had dinner the first night back. It was a long dinner at a restaurant she'd chosen near the river, and somewhere in the middle of it, the professional framing that we'd both been maintaining fell away in the way that framings fall away when nobody is actually committed to keeping them up. She said something personal, something about her own history, a relationship that had ended badly, the particular loneliness of being professionally successful and personally uncertain. She said it without performing vulnerability. She said it the way you say something true when the evening has reached the point where true things feel appropriate. I said something true in return, about the marriage ending, about the apartment in Kensington that felt different at 61 than it had felt at 40, about the odd experience of being good at your professional life and genuinely uncertain about the rest. We sat with those things between us on the table. Then she looked at me in a way that I had been half expecting and half pretending I hadn't and said, I think you're a more interesting person than your professional reputation suggests. That's a good thing or a bad thing? I said. Definitely good, she said. The professional reputation is very good. The person is better, reader, I was lost. Right there, at that table, at 61 years old with 28 years of professional discipline behind me, I was completely and entirely lost. The investment proposal arrived formally in November. A structured note linked to a Philippine infrastructure bond portfolio, denominated in sterling for my convenience, with a 2-year lockup and a projected return profile she had modeled carefully. The documentation was extensive. The legal structure was described in detail. The counterparty was a Manila-based entity she described as the investment vehicle arm of the wealth management firm she worked for. I reviewed it myself, thoroughly, or so I believed. I checked the firm's registration details, which were real. I checked the legal framework she cited, which was accurate in its description of legitimate Philippine investment structures. I checked the bond reference numbers, several of which traced to real instruments. The prospectus ran to 47 pages, and it read like a 47-page prospectus, written by people who knew how to write prospectuses. I did not instruct an independent Manila-based lawyer to verify the counterparty entity's actual status and operating history. That is the critical omission. Every other piece of due diligence I performed was genuine and was designed to satisfy it. The one piece I skipped was the piece that would have ended everything before it started. I skipped it because I trusted her. And because I trusted her, I trusted the document she had built on the same foundation that my trust in her occupied. The document and the relationship had the same ground, which meant the document's integrity was only as strong as the relationship's honesty, and I had no independent verification of either. I committed £200,000 in November. This felt considered and appropriately cautious for an initial position. She sent me a confirmation of the allocation. It bore logos and reference numbers that looked precisely correct. She said, when I called to confirm she'd received the transfer, Vic, I want to make sure you know that I was careful about whether to bring this to you specifically. I know your background. I know you'll hold me to the analysis. I didn't offer this to you as a favor. I offered it because I genuinely think it's right for your portfolio, and because I think you're the right kind of investor for this structure. I felt hearing this that I was being seen professionally in a way that mattered to me. I felt that she had chosen me not as a mark, but as a peer. That feeling was the most expensive feeling I have ever had. The second tranche came in January. She explained that the fund had capacity for an additional allocation before the subscription window closed, and that the Q4 performance on the underlying portfolio had been strong enough to support expanding the position. She sent me a quarterly report. It was detailed and showed positive movement consistent with what she had projected. I committed another £150,000. The relationship had deepened by this point in ways that made the financial conversation feel secondary. We spoke daily. I visited Manila again in December, Christmas week, which I told myself was coincidental with the season and which obviously wasn't. She introduced me to a colleague of hers named Mark, a pleasant Filipino man, who seemed to confirm through his existence and his evident professional familiarity with Liezl that she operated in a real professional world with real professional relationships. I met a friend of hers at a dinner, a woman named Dina, who spoke about Liezl with the warmth and specificity of someone who had known her for years. None of these people were fraudulent, as far as I know. The world she showed me was largely real. The investment vehicle sitting at the center of it was not. In February, she mentioned that the fund management company was offering existing investors the opportunity to increase their allocation ahead of a secondary issuance that would be offered to new investors at a lower return profile. Existing investors who added to their position before the secondary round would lock in the better terms. The window was 48 hours. I committed £155,000. I was at £505,000 by the end of February. I did not know this was the final number. I thought it was a position I was building toward a longer-term structure that made sense in my overall wealth management picture. I had told Jeffrey about the first tranche in general terms. I had not told him the total. I think some part of me knew what he would say. The first sign that something was wrong arrived in March, in the form of a question I asked that she took slightly too long to answer. I had asked for the fund's ISIN, the International Securities Identification Number, that any legitimate bond instrument carries, and that can be verified through a central database in under 30 seconds. It was a basic request. It was the kind of request I would have made of any investment vehicle in any other context in my entire career. I had not made it before because I had been reviewing documentation that always supplied it, and I had been trusting that the numbers I was looking at were real. She said she'd get it from the fund administrator and send it through. She'd have it by end of day. It didn't come end of day. She said the administrator was in a different time zone and she'd have it in the morning. It didn't come in the morning. She said there had been an internal IT issue affecting the document management system. She'd have it by Friday. During those 3 days, something clarified in my thinking that I had been keeping deliberately unclear. I went back to the prospectus and looked at it differently. Not with the eyes that had been looking for confirmation, but with the eyes I use when I am reviewing a document I suspect. A different quality of reading, slower, more lateral, asking not just what's here but what should be here that isn't. The fund administrator address in the prospectus was a registered address in the Cayman Islands. When I traced it, it corresponded to a registered agent firm, legitimate as a business, routinely used by legitimate funds. But when I searched for any public trace of the specific fund entity through channels that legitimate funds leave traces in, I found nothing. No regulatory filings, no press mentions, no industry database entries. Nothing that a fund managing this volume of assets would invisibly fail to generate. I called Liezl on a Thursday morning at 7 a.m. Manila time, she answered. I need you to tell me the truth about something, I said. Of course, she said. Her voice was exactly normal. The fund, the entity managing the portfolio, does it exist? A pause. The length of the pause was the answer. Vic, she said, does it exist? There have been some complications, she said, with the structure. The underlying assets are real, but the vehicle, the specific entity, is being reorganized. There's been a regulatory issue that I became aware of recently, and I've been trying to understand how to. Liezl, I said. Stop. She stopped. Tell me where the £505,000 is, I said. The line was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I checked the call was still connected. Then she said very quietly, I'm sorry, Vic. I put the phone down. I sat in my hotel room. I was in Manila for a meeting that now would not happen, And I sat with those 3 words and the specific silence that follows them when you understand exactly what they mean. I called Jeffrey. He answered on the second ring, and I told him everything in about 8 minutes without stopping. He was silent through all of it. When I finished, he said one word: when. 3 tranches, I said. November, January, February. £505,000. The silence on his end was the silence of a man absorbing information that is worse than he feared and better than he knows it's going to feel later. Have you called your solicitor? He said. Not yet. Call them now. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. He called back in 15. He had already spoken to the senior partner at the legal firm we used for international matters. He had already pulled up what public information existed on the Manila entity, which confirmed everything my own search had found, which was nothing useful. He was already doing what Jeffrey does in a crisis, which is move very fast along very precise tracks. I reported to the SEC in the Philippines the following day. I reported to the Metropolitan Police in London. I engaged a Manila-based law firm, verified this time through 3 independent sources before I signed anything, to assist with the local investigation. I provided everything: the prospectus, the confirmation documents, the transfer records, the email correspondence, every piece of the paper trail that I had carefully maintained as a professional habit, and that now served a very different purpose than I'd intended. The investigation confirmed what I already knew. The investment vehicle was fabricated. The documentation had been constructed with professional-grade care. Sourced terminology, accurate regulatory references, real underlying instruments cited in positions that didn't actually exist. The entity had no operating history, no regulatory filings, no legitimate structure. The accounts that had received the funds had been operational for the duration of the fraud and closed within days of the final transfer. Liezl's registration with the firm named on her business card was nominal. She had been associated with the firm briefly in a clerical capacity 3 years earlier, and her credentials had apparently been maintained as a surface identity that would pass a basic check. The firm itself had no knowledge of the investment vehicle or the transactions. The recovered amount was £22,000 from a third-party account that the investigators traced in the early stages before the funds dispersed further. £483,000 was gone. Jeffrey flew out to Manila. I had not asked him to. He arrived on a Saturday morning and took the room next to mine in the hotel, and for the first 3 days he managed the practical side of the investigation response, while I sat with the weight of what had happened and what it meant. On the 4th evening we had dinner at a restaurant that neither of us paid much attention to, and he said, without preamble, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "All right," I said. "When did you know? Not know, but the other kind of knowing. The kind that lives at the back." I looked at my glass for a moment. "October," I said. "When you asked me what I was doing and I said regional market work." He nodded. "That's what I thought." "I knew something was off in the way that you know when a pitch is slightly too well constructed," I said. "When every objection has been anticipated and answered. Real investments have rough edges. Rough edges come from the reality of building something. This one was smooth all the way through, but you went in anyway." I told myself the smoothness was professionalism, I said. I told myself that the quality of the documentation reflected the quality of the opportunity. I told myself a lot of things, and Liezl. I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. "And Liezl. You knew the 2 things were connected and you didn't separate them." "I didn't want to separate them," I said. Separating them would have meant questioning one in order to examine the other, and I wasn't ready to question her. Jeffrey looked at me with the particular expression he has when he has been right about something he didn't want to be right about. "I build my professional reputation on being the person who sees through this," I said. "I have told clients, I have told people sitting across a desk from me in my own office, that the sophistication of the documentation is not evidence of the legitimacy of the instrument." "I have said those exact words." "I know," he said. "I've heard you say them." And then I sat across from a woman who had done her homework on me specifically, who had read my public work, who understood my professional framework, who knew exactly which parts of the analysis would satisfy me and built those parts with precision, and I let the analysis satisfy me because I wanted it to. He didn't say anything. "The expertise didn't protect me," I said. "She used the expertise. She built something that was designed to pass the review of someone with my specific background. I wasn't fooled despite what I know. I was fooled through it." Jeffrey picked up his glass and looked at it and put it down. What are you going to do? He said. Go home, I said. Fix what can be fixed. Tell the truth about what happened. And spend a very long time thinking about the difference between knowing something professionally and knowing it in the way that actually protects you. I gave a talk at a wealth management conference in London 4 months after I came home. It was not a summit I had been invited to as an expert. It was one where I had called the organizer and asked if I could speak and explained what I wanted to say. He said yes without hesitating, which surprised me, and then he said the topic, expert failure, the specific vulnerability of professional confidence, was something the industry talked around but never directly, and that he'd been waiting for someone credible to address it. I stood at the front of a room of 300 financial professionals and told them what had happened to me, the numbers, the mechanism, the specific moment in October when I had noticed the smoothness of the pitch and filed it as a sign of quality, the relationship, the way the investment and the personal trust had been constructed on the same foundation, so that questioning one felt like questioning both, the as-in request and the 3-day delay and the phone call and the 3 words. The room was very quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of people embarrassed on my behalf, the quiet of people recognizing something. Afterward, a woman came up to me, 50s, institutional fund manager, the kind of precise professional manner that signals 20 years of serious work. She said, I'm going to show this to my team, not as a cautionary tale about fraud, as a cautionary tale about confidence. That's the right framing, I said. The expertise made you more vulnerable, not less, she said. She calibrated to my level of scrutiny, I said. She built what she knew I would check and left the structural gap below what she expected me to look at. She was right about what I would look at and right about what I would skip, because she'd done her research and I hadn't done mine. The woman nodded slowly. Independent verification, she said. Always, I said. Regardless of how much you trust the source, regardless of how sophisticated you are, regardless of how well you understand the product, the verification is the protection, not the understanding. The understanding can be targeted. The verification can't. She thanked me and left. I stood for a moment in the emptying conference room and thought about a reception in BGC on a November evening, and a woman in a maroon dress with business cards, and a very clear understanding of what a man who has spent 28 years being the smartest person in the room needs to believe about himself. She had given me that belief. It cost me £505,000. Claire came to visit in the spring. She lives in Edinburgh, and she had heard about what happened not from me, but from Marcus, who had heard from a family friend, and she arrived without much warning and made tea in my Kensington kitchen and sat across from me at the table and said, very directly in the way she has always been direct, Dad, are you all right? I'm intact, I said. Financially bruised, but intact. I'm not asking about the money, she said. I looked at my tea. The money is the easy part, I said. The money is a number. It's large and it's gone, and I have to adjust my expectations for the next 15 years accordingly. That's manageable, I paused. What's harder is what it tells me about myself. What does it tell you? That I had a blind spot, I said. A specific one. I thought professional expertise was a kind of armor. I thought knowing how these things worked protected me from being inside one. It doesn't. It makes you a better target for anyone who understands your framework well enough to work within it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, and her Liezl? I looked at the kitchen wall. Outside the window, the Kensington street was doing its ordinary things. The buses, the pedestrians, the plane trees in their first spring green. She was very good at her work, I said. Whatever I think about what she did, I can't pretend she wasn't skilled. She understood people, and she understood markets, and she understood how to read a specific kind of man and give him exactly what he needed to believe. I paused. I was that kind of man. I had been that kind of man for 3 years without knowing it, and she found me at exactly the right moment. Do you blame yourself? For the investment decisions, partly, I said. I skipped a step I shouldn't have skipped. That's on me. For trusting her as a person, I don't know. She earned the trust she got. The trust was appropriate for the person she appeared to be. The person she appeared to be wasn't the person she was. I'm not sure I could have known that without the independent verification that would have unraveled the investment structure. Claire reached across the table and put her hand on mine briefly. The independent verification, she said with a faint trace of a smile. Always, I said. It's all I say now. Every talk, every client meeting, every conversation where money and trust are in the same room. Check the thing separately from the person telling you about the thing. The person and the thing are not the same evidence. She stayed for the weekend. We cooked together on Saturday evening, a complicated French thing she had found in a cookbook she'd bought at a charity shop in Edinburgh that required more effort than either of us had been expecting, but turned out well. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about her work and Marcus's life in Vancouver and the particular beauty of Edinburgh in April and things that had nothing to do with Manila. At the end of the weekend, she stood in the hallway putting on her coat and said, "I'm proud of you for talking about it publicly. That takes something." "It takes less than you'd think," I said. "When you've spent 28 years telling other people the truth about risk, it turns out you have a reasonable tolerance for saying difficult, true things out loud, even about yourself." "Especially about yourself," I said. "That's the point, isn't it? The expertise only works if it applies equally in every direction." She kissed my cheek and left. I heard the front door close. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet. Then I went back to the kitchen and poured myself the last of the wine, and sat at the table where we had eaten, and looked at the empty plates, and thought about the difference between the man who had arrived at that summit in BGC 14 months ago and the man sitting in his kitchen in Kensington now. The first man was certain. The second man is careful. Those are not the same thing, and knowing the difference cost me more than I had, and I would not trade the knowing for the not knowing. That is as close to peace as I have come. Most evenings it is enough.